Picture this: a maximum security prison, but it's built entirely on the moon. Now, as we stand right on the edge of becoming a multiplanetary species, most of our big, ambitious plans are focused entirely on the hardcore engineering feats we need just to, keep us alive up there. But here's a question we don't ask enough. What happens when we drag our oldest, most intractable problems with us into the absolute void? Today, we are going to unpack the wildly chilling, yet absolutely fascinating concept of space-based deterrence. We're talking a complete collision of international space law, cutting-edge thermal engineering, and some incredibly deep, dark existential psychology.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll kick things off with crime in the void, move right into the sovereignty pocket loophole, explore thermodynamic real estate, and finally dive deep into the existential audit and the cognitive forge.
All right, let's jump into Section 1, Crime in the Void, or the inevitability of human deviance. We have to start with a pretty fundamental, albeit uncomfortable problem. The vast emptiness of space isn't going to magically erase our flaws. Human deviance is inevitably going to follow us to the stars. I mean, as long as there have been people, there's been crime, right? Our expansion into the cosmos isn't going to suddenly cure our darker impulses. Now, you might be thinking, wait, aren't astronauts basically the most highly vetted, super stable people on Earth? And yeah, the roughly 550 people who have been to space so far absolutely are. They go through insane psychological evaluations. But as long-term human presence in space scales up and just becomes a normal, everyday reality, criminologists fully expect to see a high rate of deviant conflict. Which begs the question, how exactly do you lock someone up in a place where no nation technically owns the land? To give you an idea of how real this risk is, get this. There was an Earthbound experiment set up specifically to test how humans handle the sheer, unbroken isolation of space. It was a 100-day mock space mission conducted by Russia, and things went south incredibly fast. The environment got so psychologically oppressive that the commander of the mission, again, a highly vetted professional, committed battery, assault, and attempted murder. Think about that for a second. Even with the most stable minds we can find, the psychological strain of space isn't just a minor hurdle. It is a literal pressure cooker for deviance. Confining people in those extremes practically provokes violent behavior. That brings us to Section 2, the sovereignty pocket loophole, navigating the Outer Space Treaty. Okay, so to understand how a state could even legally build a detention facility on the moon, we have to look at this massive, glaring paradox in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. It's like a giant puzzle. On one hand, you have Article 2, which explicitly says that outer space, including the moon, is not subject to national appropriation. Basically, you absolutely cannot plant a flag and say, this lunar crater is ours. But then there's Article 8, and Article 8 grants a state absolute total jurisdiction and control over any registered object they launch into space. So the treaty forbids you from owning the dirt, but gives you total jurisdiction over the hardware you park on that dirt. It creates this absolutely massive legal loophole. And this leads us to what legal scholars call sovereignty pockets. Basically, if you continuously operate a physical structure on the lunar surface, you're establishing a permanent, untouchable pocket of jurisdiction. Under customary international law, just having continuous possession of that spot basically creates a de facto territorial claim without actually violating the strict wording of the treaty. Because, think about it, if someone unauthorized walks into your registered lunar base, they are violating your Article 8 rights. So the physical footprint of the habitat essentially becomes a sovereign enclave. It effectively turns that little patch of lunar terrain into tightly controlled private real estate. Now, how this plays out really depends on who is actually running the facility. Under Article 6, states are on the hook internationally for what their non-governmental entities do in space. So a corporate-run lunar prison is super appealing, because it allows states to outsource the massive operational risks to a private corporation. It's the ultimate diplomatic buffer. On the flip side, if a facility is state-funded, it operates directly under the sovereign's registry. But they have a totally different hurdle. They have to strictly obey Article 4, which completely bans military fortifications on celestial bodies. So if a government wanted to build a maximum security space prison, they'd almost certainly have to disguise it as a dual-use scientific research base or a commercial data center to fly under the radar. Moving right along to Section 3, thermodynamic real estate and keeping the solitary cell alive. So that massive legal loophole we just talked about, well, it slams right into a brick wall of harsh physics on the moon. Surviving up there requires an extreme thermodynamic loop, which totally upends how we think about building things.
You can't just drop a solitary confinement cell onto the surface like a shipping container. The moon goes through lethal temperature swings. We're talking plunging down to negative 140 degrees Celsius during the night span and blasting up to 150 degrees Celsius during the day. Any functional habitat has to be totally integrated into this brutal landscape. You'd literally have to bury the facility under 2 to 4 meters of regolith, moon dust basically, just to manage those insane thermal extremes and shield against constant cosmic radiation.
But here's the real kicker. Throwing a bunch of insulation over the building is only half the battle. The real engineering nightmare is rejecting heat in a vacuum. Because there's no air and space to conduct heat away, machines overheat unbelievably fast. The proposed thermodynamic solution to this is brilliant, but honestly, terrifyingly dystopian. They would pair energy-hungry commercial data centers right next to the human cells. Using a closed water-to-water heat pump system, all that massive waste heat generated by the computer servers is safely rejected by using it to warm the human habitat. It totally solves the heat crisis in the vacuum, and on top of that, it slashes the facility's electricity consumption by over 30%. It creates a completely self-sustaining utility loop.
15 degrees Celsius. Think about the sheer existential weight of that number for a second. In this integrated system, 15 degrees Celsius is the exact temperature of the warm return water cycling back from that nearby data center. That ambient exhaust heat, literal waste energy from computer servers crunching commercial data, is what would absolutely keep a human detainee alive. It's the only thing preventing them from freezing to death in the dead silence of a lunar lava tube. And that brings us to Section 4, the Existential Audit. Solitary confinement in the void.
So let's step out of the physical engineering for a minute and step into the mind of the isolated prisoner. How exactly does the state use this incredibly bleak environment for punishment? Well, the U.S. Constitution's Eighth Amendment strictly protects against cruel and unusual punishment, for sure. But courts have long held that it doesn't guarantee a comfortable prison. So, while actual physical torture is totally outlawed, a theoretical lunar prison doesn't actually need to lay a single finger on an inmate. The state can just leverage the sheer, silent, unyielding physical reality of the moon itself to force an inescapable internal reckoning. The environment literally does the heavy psychological lifting for them. Put yourself in their shoes for a second. What does absolute silence on the moon actually feel like? First off, you have total physical isolation inside a subterranean lunar cavern. You are cut off from literally everything you've ever known. Second, there's a complete severing of all external feedback. Down here on Earth, when people want to avoid looking at themselves, what do? They project their identity into their cars, their jobs, social media, their wealth. But up there, all of that armor is systematically stripped away. No internet, no social hierarchy, no background noise, not even a sky to look at. Just endless gray dust. This absolute sensory deprivation forces what psychologists call an existential audit. It's essentially a controlled detonation of the ego. You're left entirely alone in the void, forced to confront a raw, terrifyingly simple version of yourself, without any of your earthly distractions.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the cognitive forge, and rebuilding the antisocial mind. So what is the point of all this? Is it just to inflict endless suffering? Actually, no. The objective outlined in these Penology theories isn't just about punishment. The ultimate goal is reshaping antisocial minds. It specifically targets people whose psychological makeup severely lacks empathy, people who just cannot view other humans as equally complex beings. That specific lack of empathy is usually what drives violent crime and exploitation in the first place, right? So by combining the inescapable physics of the lunar vacuum with the crushing psychological pressure of total isolation, this space-based deterrent acts as a cognitive forge. It's designed to completely melt down the antisocial ego to its absolute base components. When someone is completely stripped of all earthly context, they eventually hit a wall, and they have to confront one unavoidable truth. Sitting in that utterly silent cell, staring at those concrete walls, it suddenly clicks. Their very breath, their core survival, is 100% dependent on the heat of a server processing commercial data, a system built, maintained, and managed by the unseen hands of other human beings millions of miles away. They are forced to fully internalize that their existence relies entirely on human cooperation and complex social structures. It's meant to be a complete, ground-up rebuilding of a cooperative social actor. It forces a visceral understanding of human interconnectedness before they are ever permitted to return to Earth. It's absolutely wild, isn't it? It's a staggering concept that mashes up the cold, unforgiving reality of astrophysics with the deepest vulnerabilities of the human psyche. Take a moment and just think about your own reliance on your earthly distractions, your social status, your digital identity, the constant noise of life. If all of that was just ripped away and you were placed in that 15-degree cell, buried under tons of moon dust, in a lethal vacuum, how would you handle it? Would your own sense of self survive the existential audit of the lunar void?